Hola mis estudiantes, hoy estamos en la 10ª semana, ¿no? En la semana 10 y esta semana estamos hablando de los verbos gustar, tener y ir y se encuentran en diferentes partes del libro de texto. Entonces les he escrito la página de donde se encuentre cada cosa en el libro, ¿no? Esta semana voy a empezar a explicar un poco en español y también luego explicar un poco en inglés, ¿no? Para que puedan estar como escuchando un poco de español más en su vida diaria, ¿no? Ok. Primero vamos a estar hablando de gustar. Gustar es un verbo muy diferente a todos los demás verbos que hemos hablado hasta ahorita, porque gustar es alguno de esos verbos como encantar, fascinar y entre otras, ¿no? Que primero va el verbo y luego va el sujeto, ¿no? Entonces el sujeto siempre sigue el verbo en el verbo gustar. Es muy diferente al inglés, ¿no? En inglés uno dice I like roses, I like tulips, I like movies, ¿no? Siempre va sujeto, verbo y objeto, ¿no? Pero en español el objeto se convierte en el sujeto. Y les voy a explicar cómo. Hay 6 formas, ¿no? De gustar. Normalmente, como tengo gusto, gustas, gusta, gustamos, gusta, gustáis, ¿no? Gustan. Las formas más comunes son gusta y gustan, porque casi siempre cuando estamos hablando de gustos, estamos hablando de cosas, ¿no? Estamos hablando de películas, libros, preferencias, ¿no? O que tienen que ver con objetos. Entonces, las formas más comunes son gusta y gustan, pero también se puede usar gusto o gustas, ¿no? Por ejemplo, si uno dice, no, te gusto, es decir, yo te gusto a ti, ¿no? Si uno dice, me gustas, ¿no? Es decir, tú me gustas a mí. El sujeto tú, ¿no? Se entiende, ¿no? Si uno dice nos gustamos, es decir, nos gustamos a nosotros, ¿no? El sujeto se entiende después del verbo, ¿ok? Ahora les voy a explicar un poco en inglés, ¿no? Para que entiendan un poco mejor, ¿ok? Gustar is a very particular type of verb. It is a verb that is in a list of other verbs. Verbs like encantar, no, fascinar, molestar. This word means to be bothered, okay, so it doesn't have the same meaning in English. And these verbs generally are formulated very different from how we formulate them in English. In English, if we want to talk about likes, right, we still have a subject-verb context. But remember, for example, if we say something like, I like flowers, I like roses, I like tulips, etc., right? We're still I like, right? You like, he likes, right? The subject is coming before the verb. That's because that is the sentence structure that operates in English. But if you remember, that is not the only possible formulation of sentences in Spanish. Spanish can have lots of different types of formulations. It is not confined to that subject-verb complement order in the same way that English is. And so gustar is a good example of that, because in gustar, the verb comes first, and what is the subject, or what defines the verb, comes next. So for example, a common error in students' knowledge of Spanish is saying something like yo gusto. Yo gusto doesn't mean anything in Spanish, because you wouldn't say I like in Spanish. If, for example, you wanted to say you liked movies in Spanish, you would say like movies, you know, me like movies. You know, it would be there's almost no way to even literally translate it, because it would not really, the formulation of it would not exist as it does in Spanish in English. There's no literal direct translation. So the best way to learn a verb like gustar, right, is to just learn it as it is and try to practice it as it is without trying to fit it into the way that you would speak it in English, because the way you would say it in English cannot be translated into Spanish. So, okay, so instead of, we learned our personal pronouns, right, or sometimes also called subject pronouns. We learned like yo, tú, él, ella, usted, right? With the verb gustar, we also add in what we call sometimes a personal pronoun. So instead of yo, you would use me. Instead of tú, you would use te. Instead of él, ella, usted, you would use le. Instead of nosotros, you would use nos. Instead of vosotros, you would use os. And instead of ellos, ellas, ustedes, you would use les. So you would substitute these. That's a good way of looking at it. It's not exactly accurate, but it's the best way to explain it to an English speaker. You would substitute these words for I, you, he, she, instead of your normal subject pronouns with a verb like gustar, okay? So this is like saying I. It's not exactly, but for the explanation, it's like saying I like. Now, there are other forms of gustar, but I like to simplify the forms of gustar into two that are the most prevalent, because the other forms are used really in context of relationships. So, for example, and so they're less common and a little bit more rare. For example, if you wanted to say I like you, you would say me gustas, right? But me, I, gustas, like you, right? So the you in that context is understood. It's not even said because you used gustas. It's a little bit complex to understand. So that's why I kind of boil them down into these two, because normally when we're talking about likes and dislikes, we're talking about objects. And so that's why I kind of tend to simplify it into when we're talking about things, things that we might like. So when we're talking about things that we might like, if we're talking about a singular thing that we like, therefore the second term that we find is a singular subject or a singular thing, a singular object, we are going to use gusta. If the thing that we like is a plural thing, as in there's more than one of those things, there's more than one movie, more than one book, more than one object that we're talking about, then we're going to use gustan. And that's it. Those are the two forms that are the most common of this verb. And either one is going to be used with singular things we like, and the other one is going to be used with plural things that we like. Now, the only addition to this is that also there's the form that we would use with singulars is also the same form we would use with infinitives. So if we're talking about a singular thing or an infinitive, and we know it's an infinitive, right, because it's going to end in an AR, ER, or IR. So if it's either a singular thing or an infinitive, we know that it's going to use gusta. If it's a plural thing, we know that it's going to use gustan. And that's it, right? So how would we use that in practice? Because that can be a little bit confusing, right? So now I've given you these examples, right? And it can be a little bit confusing. How do we actually formulate that into an actual sentence? Well, that's what I thought we would do in some of these examples. So here my example is, a Elena, then blank blank, las flores. Okay, well, let's take it apart. Right? So the first thing that we know, remember, is that we're going to look after the verb to find the subject. So the subject is here, right? Because it's after the verb. And notice that it's plural. So remember, when we have plural things, we're going to use gustan. So we know here we're going to use gustan. But wait, we're missing something, because gustan cannot work on its own. It needs a personal pronoun, right? It needs these personal pronouns, okay? So then what am I gonna do? Okay, well, now I have to look and see, who am I talking about? Who is it that's doing the liking, right? Who's doing the liking? Well, in this context, Elena is doing the liking, right? So even though she isn't the subject, she's the one doing the liking. So Elena would be, right, él, ella, usted. And remember, when we're going to replace something that's él, ella, usted, we're going to replace it with le. So here we would have to have le. A Elena le gustan las flores. And it's a little bit complex, but I'm trying to simplify it for y'all guys as much as possible. Okay, so a mí, blank, blank, no, viajar. Oh, look here. It ends in an AR, so what do I know that it is? It's an infinitive, right? I know it has to be an infinitive. So I know anytime I have an infinitive, I'm going to have gusta, okay? So I'm gonna write gusta there. Oh, but I'm still missing my pronoun. I'm missing my pronoun. And I know, right, I can't have gusta without my pronoun. It doesn't work without a pronoun, right? So I have to have it. It's a necessary piece of my formulation of the verb. So I have to look at who is doing the liking. Who is doing the liking? Oh, me, I am. So, me. Me gusta viajar. A mí me gusta viajar. ¿Ok? A ti, blank, blank, el libro de Harry Potter. No? Remember, right, we look at the end for the subject. So, here, right? We look here. And if I'm saying el libro, how many libros am I talking about? Just one. I'm talking about liking one thing. So remember, when I'm talking about liking one thing, I'm going to use gusta. So I know that I have to put gusta here. But I'm still missing my pronoun, right? So who is doing the liking? Who is doing the liking? Oh, a ti. So I know te is the pronoun that I need, right? Okay. A Mariana y yo, blank, blank, ir al teatro. Oh, look. Another infinitive. And I know it's an infinitive, right? It's an IR. No? Okay, so remember, anytime I have an infinitive, I'm going to use gusta. Okay? So I know I have to use gusta. This one is a little bit more complicated, right? Because it's a Mariana y yo. But anytime there's a group and I am in the group, I know it's a nosotros. So that's technically a nosotros. So if it's a nosotros, then the pronoun has to be nos. Right? A Mariana y yo, a Mariana y yo nos gusta ir al teatro. ¿No? Okay. A Víctor y Hugo, blank, blank, las películas de Almodóvar. Okay? So here again, I'm going to look to the end for my subject. And I have películas and I have more than one. So when I'm talking about liking plural things, right, I'm going to use gustan. So I have to put gustan here. And remember, when I have proper names, in general, unless I'm in the group, right, if I have proper names, I always have a third person. So if, so this is a third person, right? That's a third person. That's le o les. So here I have plural third people. So I always am going to have les. Okay? A Hugo y a Víctor les gustan las películas de Almodóvar. Okay? I know it's a little bit complicated, but this is pretty much as simple as it gets. All right, now we're gonna move on to tener and ir, and I have to move my phone a little bit so y'all can see the rest of the chalkboard. Okay. Okay. Lo importante de tener, más que nada, es que tener ocupa expresiones que en inglés nosotros normalmente hablaríamos con los verbos que son en español cero estar, ¿no? En inglés, usaríamos to be, ¿no? To be hungry, to be thirsty, ¿no? I am thirsty, I am hungry, ¿no? Son expresiones que en inglés ocuparían ese to be, ¿no? Pero en español usan tener, ¿no? Tengo hambre, tengo sed, ¿no? Además, la conjugación de tener es un poco raro, ¿no? Tener es un verbo que es irregular en yo, pero también irregular con cambios en la raíz. Entonces ocupa esas dos formas, ¿no? Ocupa una bota y también es irregular en yo, ¿no? Se considera, ¿no?, uno de esos verbos que en inglés se llaman a veces go verbs, ¿no? Ok, ahora les voy a explicar un poco en inglés para que entiendan un poco mejor, ¿no? Ok, so tener is a verb. One of the things that is important about tener is that we would use tener for situations where in English we would use to be, right? So tener technically means to have. I have, you have, he has, no, we have, they have, etc. In English we would say, I'm hungry. I am hungry. Not I have hunger. But in Spanish we would say, I have hunger. No? So here's some expressions. This is just a few that I picked out of the book. There are more right in your book on page 72 that are expressions that in English would use to be, but in Spanish we would use tener or to have. No? Tener suerte. In English we would say to be lucky, but in Spanish we would say to have luck. Tener razón. In English we would say to be right, but in Spanish we would say to have reason, right? Tener miedo, no? To be afraid, but in Spanish we would say to have fear. Tener hambre, tener sed. To be hungry, to be thirsty, but in Spanish we would say to have hunger, to have thirst. Tener calor, tener frío, to be hot or to be cold, but in Spanish we would say I have heat, I have cold, right? O tener paciencia, no? To have, in English this is one that would be kind of similar, right? To have patience, no? Okay. You might also notice in the conjugation of tener that it is incredibly irregular. It is sometimes taught with irregular stem changing verbs, which we won't learn until chapter 4. But it's actually irregular on more than one front, right? So it's better if you just kind of memorize it as it is and don't try to take it apart. But it's what we would consider an irregular yo verb, but it is also a stem changing verb. It is actually both together. So that's why I recommend that you just kind of learn it as it is and don't try to fit it into any type of category. It is sometimes taught with irregular verbs, sometimes it's taught in other categories. Just kind of depends on the textbook where it places it. I've seen it many different ways, but it is just a very irregular conjugation. Okay? Let's do some examples. Okay? Yo prisa todos los días. I'm always in a hurry, ¿no? Yo tengo prisa todos los días. Not I am in a hurry, but I have hurry, ¿no? Nosotros suerte en Las Vegas. No, nosotros tenemos suerte en Las Vegas. We have luck in Las Vegas. Tú tienes razón en tus opiniones, ¿no? You always have the reason in your opinions, ¿no? María tiene calor en el verano. María's hot in the summertime, ¿no? Juan y José tienen frío en Alaska, ¿no? Juan y José are hot in Alaska, no? So this is an interesting thing, although it's kind of an aside, that a lot of English speakers don't know, that actually the name Jose in English is actually two names in Spanish. There's Jose, no accent mark, and Jose, accent mark, and they're actually two separate names. So if you see this and you pronounce it wrong, you actually might be mispronouncing somebody's name. Ok. Luego vamos a hablar un poco de ir. Ir es como se habla de acciones en un futuro inmediato, ¿no? El futuro simple en español se ocupa más para situaciones que son mucho más en el futuro, ¿no? Como algunos meses o más como a veces años, ¿no? Como por ejemplo, si uno dice, bueno, en 3 años iré a España, ¿no? Eso es iré, ¿no? Iré, un simple futuro, porque está mucho en el futuro, ¿no? Pero si lo vas a hacer en una semana o si viene mañana, ¿no? Más que nada vas a ocupar, ¿no? Este verbo ir. Voy a la tienda, ¿no? Vamos de compras mañana, o vamos este fin de semana al centro comercial, ¿no? Vas a usar ir para expresar que ese futuro no es tan futuro, pero es un futuro mucho más inmediato, ¿no? Ahora te das cuenta, ¿no? Que el verbo ir se conjuga totalmente irregular, ¿no? Es muy irregular en forma de otras, ¿no? De otros verbos. Es como ser, ¿no? Que no tiene como una pauta que seguir. Exactamente funciona como funciona. Una cosa que a veces se confunde con ir es el verbo ver. Los anglohablantes muchas veces no pueden confundir el verbo ir y el verbo ver, porque suenan para un anglohablante muy parecido, ¿no? No en la forma yo, ¿no? Como yo voy, yo veo, pero tú vas, tú ves, ¿no? Él, ella va, él, ella ve, ¿no? Uno puede ver que son un poco parecidos en cómo se suena ese verbo, y para un anglohablante la diferencia entre la A y la E, o sea, no suena muy diferente. Ok, ahora les voy a explicar un poco en inglés para que entiendan un poco mejor. Ok, ir is a verb that means to go. And in Spanish, it is used to talk about immediate future actions. For example, if you're going to do something tomorrow, or this weekend, or next week, you would definitely use ir to talk about that action in the future. This is actually something that we also do in English. I'm going to the store tomorrow. My mom and I we're going to the mall on Saturday, right? We would say going to do something, right? And that's exactly how this is functioning in Spanish. Sometimes people use the future simple, if they're like Googling words, to talk about future actions in Spanish. For example, iré, right? I will be going. But iré, the future simple, is a much more future-oriented tense. So you would use the future simple whenever you were talking about actions that maybe will take place a few months from now, or maybe even potentially years from now, a long way in the future, right? Something that's not an immediate future, but something that is a far away in the future. So if you said, iré a la tienda mañana, it's okay, but colloquially it might sound odd. It just depends really contextually on what it is that you're saying. But this is an easy way for you to be able to talk about the future and without a lot of additional learning on your part, right? Because ir talks about immediate future actions. So you'll notice that the conjugation of ir is completely irregular, right? It's voy, vas, va, vamos, vais, van. It's completely irregular. Ir falls into that kind of fourth category of verbs, right? We have 4 categories, or normally in English language textbooks, they separate verbs into 4 categories. They don't do this in Spanish language textbooks, but it's just how we learn Spanish in an English language context. And they separate those into regular verbs, irregular in the yo form, or sometimes called irregular first person verbs, irregular stem changers, and then irregular. This would fall into that fourth category of completely irregulars, like ser, for example, which is completely irregular and does not follow any type of logical pattern to us as English speakers. So we would use ir, right, to talk about future action. So, yo voy de compras mañana. I'm going to go shopping tomorrow. Tú vas a hacer la tarea. You're going to do your homework. Not now, probably, but at some point in the future. Teresa va a asistir a su clase, right? She's going to go to her class. Gustavo y yo vamos a ir al cine. Oh, we're going to go to the movies. The insinuation is, right, we're not doing it right this second, right? We're going to do it a little bit later. Alfredo y Tomás van a llamar a su madre. No, they're going to call their mother, not right at this moment, but probably at some point in the future. Now, you'll notice that ir is generally used with this helping word, a. See? But a just means to. In a lot of contexts. It doesn't always mean that, but in this context, that's what it means. And in English, we would do the same, right? We would say, I'm going to the store. I'm going to the mall. I'm going to do my homework. And so that to, right, in Spanish is the a, and it must be generally used with ir, right? Whenever you have ir, you're almost always, like 98% of the time, you're gonna have a helping word after it, and most of the time, that helping word is going to be a, okay? So whenever you think of ir, you wanna think of using the word a almost all the time, right? If you have voy, where's your a? No? So you wanna make sure, right, that you're using that word with its correct helping word. So I know this one has been a little bit long, but we had quite a few interesting points to cover today. And I hope that it has been very helpful. I'll continue to try to do some of the explanations in English and some in Spanish, just kind of repeating myself in both languages so that way y'all can get a little bit used to hearing a little bit more Spanish in your everyday life. All right, it's been a great week, and I will see y'all guys in week 11. Hasta la semana 11, hasta la semana entrante, mis estudiantes.